So, Brexit. Rows in Britain have never been terribly good for Ireland. And for those of you that remember your history from school, the man in the middle is Malachy. And Malachy was quite good at stoking rows in Britain. So while our good friend Henry II was killing bishops in Canterbury, he also made sure that he appointed a good friend as the Pope, Adrian IV. And Adrian IV decided to give a papal bull, which meant that he invaded Ireland with the help and aid of Malachy. So our history with Britain started with a row that was in England. A transnational row, a row which now the English would not say was anything more than English, but in fact it involved Italy, France, Ireland, and the UK. It got worse. They started to believe how wonderful they were. And going back to Richard II, they once again felt that they were great, but they were isolated. And as he says, John of Gaunt says in his wonderful soliloquy, he states at the end, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England. And you could practically feel that rolling off the lips of Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage. And unfortunately, this idea of an office of a defensive wall, a moat around this island, this is the mentality of the moment. And of course, Laurence Olivier has to feature in this. Nothing like a good piece of blockbuster propaganda like Henry V and Cry, God for Harry, England and St. George. And that propaganda, which not only was in Laurence Olivier, but in more recent permutations, can be very hazardous to your wealth. To put it bluntly, no advanced economy has engaged in an act of economic self-harm on the level of Brexit. Not in the 1930s, not in the 1920s. No country has tried to do this before. And we have to be realistic about what it's going to do to us, because we're the nearest neighbor and we still have substantial trade. That being said, we've had other English interventions that haven't gone well. Again, free real estate advice, marital counseling provided by Henry VIII, 2-for-1 offer. And we've got new senior management in Britain. So when that's your foreign minister, you know you're in trouble. And I want to draw your attention to this picture here. This is one of the first meetings between the Brexit team of the European Commission and David Davis and the Brexit negotiation team. You'll notice one crucial difference. Our Commission friends have papers. The English team does not. And this gets down to the issue of the negotiation. The British believe that they're in a negotiation process which is open. The Commission believes that they're in a negotiation process which is structured around rules and guidelines, and that they have to conform to that. The decision that was made in December was very much a product of coordination across countries, in alliance with the Irish, and driving an idea of rules and structures. But unfortunately, David Davis himself said that, well, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. That's going to be a complication into the future. So what does it mean in money terms? Well, the sector that's going to be damaged the most is one which has a significant amount of employment intensity, and that's agriculture. So when you go into Dunn's and you buy your cheddar cheese, well, there's a strange problem. The only other people that like cheddar other than the Irish are the English. And we sell a lot of it to England. In fact, we sell the majority of our cheddar to England. But without that cheddar, we don't have our milk powder. And the milk powder is what we export to China. In addition to that, when we have these trade deals, if the EU has no trade deal with the UK, Ireland has no trade deal with the UK. Ireland does not act bilaterally. Ireland acts as part of the EU bloc. With respect to the Northern Irish border, even though we've had some conversations about the transit of individuals and the common travel area, it is not fully decided what's going to happen with respect to goods. The estimate by the European Parliament is that a hard Brexit could result in a 9.4% decrease in GDP over 3 years. In a soft Brexit environment, it will result in about 3.4%. So overall, there's a lot of bad news out there from the potential of Brexit. On top of that, there are sectors of the economy which are very worried. So the sales sector is worried about profitability, especially because of their logistical supply chains. And ICT employers are becoming very worried because of the mobility of staff across borders. But most people haven't even begun the process of dealing with that. And at the end of the day, there are some very basic things. So for example, half of all international mail that comes to Ireland transits through the UK. A large part of our surface trade transits through the UK. And when we talk about industries, and I know the beef sector is one which the Irish public has had an interesting history with, the beef sector is essentially a sector orientated towards Britain. And that's going to be a big challenge for beef farmers into the future. So, and if the British decide to crash out and do WTO rules, that's going to be quite damaging to Ireland, because not only will it result in a depreciation of their exchange rate, which will make imports into Ireland more expensive, but they're also going to have a change in the tariff structure. And the only way that that tariff structure could be advantageous to Ireland is if they went to WTO at 0% for imports. Likely what would happen is that they would go with a different regime, which means that you're looking at maybe 40% for a lot of agricultural imports. We have also new management in another country. And we're getting used to that new management. It also likes shutting down the government and changing the tax regime. So in addition to relocating his very large button, the issue is that taxes are changing. And the Republican Party, as it's stated, is put on this earth for one reason and one reason only, and that is to cut taxes. And they've done that. And that's going to be a challenge now in the future for Ireland, because a lot of those changes are going to make the attractiveness of Ireland as an offshore tax hub less attractive. In fact, if you set up as an export, an IP export firm in the United States, your tax rate is going to drop as low as 15%. In Ireland, we have a new leader. It's not Leo, it's Macron. And this is really where Europe is going. And the new Europe is going to be led by a new Franco-German alliance, which is going to be primarily led by France. And we have to get used to that. And we have to get used to the fact that in that world, Brexit is not the #1 topic. In fact, it's not even number 4 or 5. It's the issue of migrants and a relatively unfriendly large mammal known as the Russian bear. For those people who are in Eastern Europe at the moment, their concern is absolutely nothing to do with Brexit. It is Russia. For those who are in Southern Europe and in Central Europe, it is migrants. Brexit is not on their agenda. They're doing us a favor. And remember, any transaction that is done in that European context is in credit or debit. So at the moment, Ireland is spending diplomatic credit like crazy. And at some point, it's going to have to pay it back. And this is where it's going to have to pay it back. Paschal has a problem. This is the European Commission's own official document on how Ireland provided state aids to Apple. This is the 13 billion euro question. And when you look at this internationally, it gets even more complex. So in the case of taxation shifting, profit shifting, you can see that you have these international IP-orientated companies. This is work done by the New York Times. This is becoming more and more of a global issue. And as governments are facing the challenges of aging populations and of basically not wanting to tax their populations any more than they have already during the crisis, they're going to be looking through other sources of revenue. And the other source of revenue are these large multinational companies with large cash held overseas. In Ireland, we have to realize how thin our economy is in respect to this. So this is the Revenue Commissioner's data with respect to tax income. So 10 firms make up 38% of our corporate tax. That's how thin the multinational base is, how important a small handful of companies are. When we look at it in terms of gross value added to the economy, this is from the latest IMF report, 1.5% of firms in Ireland make up a quarter of our employment and over half of the gross value added to the economy. So when people talk about the multinational economy, it's literally the multinational economy that drives Ireland. So if you want to know how we recovered, it's not because we were good at taking fiscal rectitude. It wasn't because we were good at suffering. It was because we had a multinational sector that was outsized and performed over the duration of the crisis, that recovered by basically late 2009. And that's had a very bad effect on our statistics. So at some point when Donal sends this slide deck on to all of you, you can enjoy this over a glass of wine. It's basically how we started to recalculate GDP. And it's about this. It's contract manufacturing and how that has changed over time. And in the past, we used to deal with royalties, and we net out the royalties of intellectual property. The new regulations, what we call ESA 2010, means that we don't do that now. So as a result, what has happened is that we got these large influxes of intellectual property, which have been onshored quarter by quarter. They are depreciated down, and as a result, we have a large spike in our GDP statistics. And that's why we've had the 26% growth rate and why we've had these very high growth rates quite recently. If you look at the underlying growth rate of the economy, it's probably around 3.5%. Not as high as what has been reported in the newspapers. And in fact, a lot of work has been done by John Fitzgerald of the ESRI looking at the Census of Industrial Production to try to verify that. We are moving it back into an era of full employment, which means there's going to be a lot of stresses and strains on the labor market with respect to wages. People are becoming scarce. Competent people are becoming scarce. But that being said, we also have a very, very generous redistribution system. So this is the OECD, and the first country there, through the use of taxes and social transfers, is Ireland, ahead of Finland, Greece, and Belgium. So Ireland has an extremely redistributive system with respect to its population. So we have a very high inequality Gini coefficient, around 0.58, and through these taxes and transfers, and I know people feel that they spend a lot of money on taxes in Ireland, but through those taxes and transfers, we drop that down to 0.31. So there's an incredible amount of heavy lifting that we do in our system to try to create equality. That said, there's a global megatrend. And the global megatrend is shown by this chart. We call it the elephant chart. And that is that in the advanced economies, a lot of people have been left behind. There hasn't been an increase in their wealth in real terms for a very long time. And that's creating resentment and a political economy response. It's part of the reason why we've had the Brexit issue. It's part of the reason why we've had the economic consequences of Mr. Trump. And Brian, in his talk, will come back to these megatrends from the political economy consequences of the elephant chart. And he will frighten you sufficiently that you'll go home shaking, which he's good at. And this is where our future is. Our future is not going to be British. Our future is going to be moving away from the rows of Britain and is going to go back to Europe, where we were before in the past. And Catherine Day, who was in charge of the European Commission, the second Irish person to be in charge of the European Commission, has a very clear metaphor for what is happening. And it's a railway station. So that's Leipzig railway station, quite appropriately. And her statement is that everyone has to go to the same destination. All trains must arrive at the same stop. How fast they go to that stop doesn't really matter, but they must all go to the same place. Britain wanted to go to another stop. And it announced that it wanted to go to another stop as early as 2012 at the closed-door meetings for the Fiscal Compact Treaty. And that was clear that France and Germany no longer could do business with them. So that means that we have to live with banking union, with capital markets union. We have to live with fiscal union at some point. And fiscal union means having an adult conversation about the 12.5% rate of tax. It means having an adult conversation about base erosion and profit shifting, and about the common consolidated corporate tax rate, and the use of a digital tax, which is what President Macron is so keen on. And then beyond that, moving into an area where Ireland really has avoided, like the plague for its entire history in Europe, common foreign and security policy and common social policy. These dimensions are underdeveloped. It is where the European Commission sees the greatest and most rapid growth and competence. And these are going to be serious challenges for Ireland into the future. And finally, as a consequence of that, political union. That this does not mean that Ireland will be ignoring Britain. There's 65 million people in Britain. It's a big place with a big market, and it's nearby. So gravity theory says we're going to have to trade with them. The relationship will be there, but it will be profoundly different. And for Ireland, it's going to be a very difficult decade getting used to the new European Union and getting used to a much more distant and possibly much more fraught relationship with the United Kingdom. Because it's not going to be a bilateral relationship, it's going to be an EU versus the United Kingdom relationship. Threats. What's next? So, there's going to be wage pressure, especially in financial services, insurance, real estate, and ICT sectors. We have a Brexit wildcard. We do not really know what's going to happen in the end. We just know it's probably going to be difficult and ugly. Ireland, well, we have a history of volatility. When you look at the economic history of Ireland, it's usually told as, well, from 1922 until 1994, we made an absolute Horlicks of it, and then we got it right, and then we made a Horlicks of it again, and now we're sort of recovering. Well, that's, though quite nice in many ways, is not quite accurate. Ireland was part of a bad neighbourhood. It was called the neighbourhood of the UK and Ireland. And it did poorly when Britain did poorly. Now Ireland does well as part of Europe, not as part of Britain. It's pulled away from the parent. But that comes with consequences. Throughout its economic history, Ireland has had great volatility and growth. And that volatility will most likely continue. And it's a feature of small open economies. We have an issue of intangible companies. New companies don't have buildings, don't have staff, don't have plant. What they do have is intellectual property. The intangible company is changing how we think about companies, about law, about taxes, and we haven't seen that fully work itself out yet. And finally, we're obsessed with property. So we've all watched The Field. A very, very long time ago, I asked a colleague in the business school, what should we do about this banking inquiry? Because I was on the banking inquiry in the Oireachtas. And he said, well, I recommend that you buy A Wonderful Life, The Field, and a mirror. And hand them out to the people in Leinster House, and that will work. That, though possibly didn't work out possibly the best way for a policy decision, it was probably the most accurate. We're obsessed with property. It's built into our DNA. We seem to be doing it again. I cannot offer any advice beyond what John B. Keane has. So in terms of that, we end on the fact that the Leo and Owen Murphy bubble, it's not a bubble, but it might be a bubble, but it's about property, so everyone feels happy because we like when property goes up, and the wealth effects in Ireland for property price increases are exceptionally strong, so it makes people happy, so nobody's going to stop it. So the conversation about property continues. It has a real impact, but people want to be in Dublin. It is the economic centre of Ireland. So if you want somebody to move to Dublin, yes, you have to pay them more. If you want people to move out of Dublin, surprisingly, it's very difficult to shift them. You're going to have to really entice them to move out of the economic centre. The final thing, and this is one of the interesting things that we included and we're going to be doing more work on, is looking at education levels and education results. And we put in this aspect about the Leaving Cert. Well, the surprising thing is that only 2% of people that got 600 points in their Leaving Cert are making over 100,000 euros a year in our survey. So despite the obsession, despite all the photographs in the Irish Times of people jumping up and down with 600 points, it is not the absolute key to wealth. Yes, most people did well on their Leaving Cert and were in the HEA category of high points, but people were mostly between 350 and 500 that did well in life. So there's something else, and what we found is that something else is that a lot of people were fixed on team sports, GAA, activities of that nature. So there is something else beyond academic credentials, and I know we are in Trinity College surrounded by professors, so we should be wary of the fact that we are highlighting other issues, but it's not just all the academic credentials, there's other social capital that has to be developed. So with that, that is your whistle-stop tour of the economy, the future, the issues of Brexit. In the question and answer time, we can talk a little bit more about the common travel area, issues with respect to tariffs and trade, and some of the complexities relating to getting used to a world of new GDP figures and new forms of transnational taxation. So with that, I hand it over to my colleague, Nafu, who will talk to you about the HR questions.